So in this video we are going to discuss a high level designing of a URL shortening service. So here we will cover three main points, like we will discuss three main points. One is API endpoints, second is URL shortening, and the third is URL redirecting. So let's look at each of these components one by one. So first we will discuss, let's say we discuss about API endpoints. Number one is API endpoints. So basically API endpoints, what do they facilitate? So they help clients to talk with the server using REST style. So I'll give a short link about the API, so you can read about them in the description box. And this URL shortening and URL redirecting use these API calls to perform their operations. So basically, to do a URL shortening, we make a post API call to basically the client sends a post API request which contains one parameter. This is basically a long URL. So we will see an example. So as you can see here, so this is a post API request which the client sends to the URL shortening service server, and this is the host which the client connects to, and this is the long URL which needs to be shortened. So this is the post request which the client has sent, and in response what we get from the server, what we get is like, so this is the HTTP response which the server sends along with the short URL, that the short URL has been created, and this is the creation timestamp, and this is an optional field which is the expired, like which says like the short URL will expire for this corresponding long URL at this timestamp. So this is an example in which we use a REST API endpoint, that is a post request sent by the client to shorten our URL. Next we will look into how we use this API calls to redirect our URL. So basically redirecting means whenever we click a short URL, how it eventually fetches the long URL and redirects us to the actual server or actual application. So for that what we use is we use the GET request. We use the GET request to fetch our long URL for a corresponding short URL. So we will also look into an example of this. So here this is an GET request for the above long URL which we just performed a shortening. So here in the GET we send this short URL and HTTP response get request API call, and the host is this is our actually URL shortening service, and this is application JSON, and in return it sends the long URL which eventually is redirected to. So now how this redirection happens, let's look into a little bit of details in a high level overview how this redirection actually occurs. So let's see, this is our second component which we had earlier mentioned also. As you can see here, this is URL redirection which we will be looking right now. So let's see how we redirect an URL. So whenever you enter the tiny URL to your browser, or you click on this tiny URL, so what happens is like, this is our client, it goes to the server which is hosting the tiny URL or the URL shortening service. So tiny URL is a URL shortening service. There are other also URL shortening services. This URL shortening service from its database fetches so basically here we send the short URL, we click the short URL and it goes to the server which is hosting this URL shortening service. From the database it fetches this corresponding map of the long URL. This is sent and the server sends this request back to the client using a long URL. Along with that, there is an interesting thing which is a status code. So this can be 301 or 302 depending on our use case. We will look into details very soon, like what does each of these denote. So let's say the server now returns the long URL along with this status code to the client, and finally the client now has this original server which it needs to connect to. It visits the long URL or the application, original application. This is the actual original application. So this is the overall overview of how a short URL redirection occurs. So now let's look into this status code of what is this, what does this status code denote, this 301 and 302. So basically this 301 says that your requested URL or requested URL means that short URL is permanently, this is an important term, just remember this, is permanently moved to long URL. So what does it means is like, first time whenever you click on the tiny URL, it redirects, it fetches, it goes to the server, it gets the long URL, and along with that we get the status code 301. So whenever we get the status code 301, it means our browser will cache this mapping of this short URL to the long URL. So in next time or in future times, this short URL won't be forwarded to the long URL. Sorry, this short URL won't be forwarded to the server to fetch the long URL. It will eventually redirect from your service directly to the actual server. So what happens is, browser caches the response and another thing, subsequent request for the same URL are not sent to URL shortening service. So whenever we get a 301 status code, it means that the requested URL is permanently moved to the long URL. Our browser caches the response, and subsequent request for the same URL, like if we click on the tiny URL, it is not moved to the shortening service, rather than, since it is present in the cache, it eventually gets the long URL and the client is able to connect to the actual service or the actual application. Whereas if we get a status code of 302, this is a contradiction. I would not say contradiction, this is the difference is like, this is a temporary movement. Like we saw here in just above in the 301, it was a permanent movement, but this one is a temporary movement. So like subsequent requests to the same URL are sent to the shortening service to convert it into the long URL, and ultimately the client fetches the or reaches the actual application using the long URL. So there are few pros and cons of this methods, of these responses. So for the, I'll write here only. So for this, the pros is like, it reduces load on the server. Like every time you don't need to go to the URL shortening service to fetch the long URL, and it reduces a load on the server. Whereas another, this is the pros for 302 service is like, these are basically helps in analytical purposes, like number of clicks made, click rate, and source of the click, etc. So all these are helpful for various analytic purposes for the person who has posted the link and who has made that short URL for his actual service and all. So he can use it for his own analytic purpose for his own business. So this is one of the benefit of sending a status response code of 302. So this is an overall high level view of how URL redirectioning happens. So in a nutshell, if we see, so client clicks on the tiny URL, it goes to the server hosting the tiny URL service or URL shortening service. It converts it into the long URL, sends the request, sends the long URL along with the status code 301 or 302 depending on your use case. And now the long URL, the client is redirected to the long URL using, that is the actual application. And these are the status response code 301 and 302, which has its own significance, and there are certain pros and cons for each of this, so which we just discussed. So now let's look into the URL shortening, which was our third component. So URL shortening, like if you have given a notice of how this URLs are shortened, so if you look here, this is basically, if you focus on this part, so this is basically a hash value. What is this hash value? So this is a, if I write down here, so basically I have a long URL, I have a hash function, let's say f of x, which takes long URL as the input and generates a hash value which is appended to the URL shortening service. So like if I say my hash value is abc123 for this long URL, so and my shortening service is, say, let's say tiny URL, so what it will happen is, like, it will look something like this: url.com/abc123. so this, in this way, this hash value is being utilized in the short URL. So this hash value can be, so a long URL can be mapped to a hash value, and using this hash value also we can get a long URL. Like if we say, let's say we have some get hash function and that returns the long URL. So now we will look into in details of each of these URL redirection, URL shortening, about this hash value and how are these hash value actually stored. Either are they stored in a hash table or something else depending on our use case, and why not if not in stored in hash table, and all those details we will be diving deep into the designing in our subsequent videos. So thank you for watching this video. I'll see you in the next video where we dive deep into this URL shortening service. So stay tuned for more interesting videos.